When Clara Vance stepped off the train in Silver Hollow, Wyoming, in the winter of 1887, she expected a business transaction, a marriage license in exchange for safety. She expected a stranger named Silas Thorne to meet her on the platform. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see curiosity. She saw recognition. Silas didn't look at her like a woman he was meeting for the first time. He looked at her like a ghost he had been haunting for a decade. He knew her favorite poetry. He knew the scar on her shoulder. He knew her sins. This wasn't a romance of convenience. It was a trap set 10 years in the making. This is the story of the cowboy who loved her and hunted her long before she ever arrived. The Union Pacific locomotive screamed as it ground to a halt, the sound tearing through the silence of the Wyoming Territory like a dying animal. Clara Vance pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the passenger car. Outside, the world was devoid of color. It was a landscape of bruised purples and aggressive grays, the sky hanging low and heavy with the promise of a blizzard that could bury a man standing up. She tightened her grip on her leather valise, her only possession of value left after the incident in Boston. She was 24 years old, but in that reflection, she looked 50. The soot from the 3-day journey had settled into the fine lines around her eyes, masking the beauty that had once been the talk of Beacon Hill. Now, that beauty was a liability. She wasn't Clara Vance, the debutante, anymore. She was a mail-order bride, a parcel delivered to a man named Silas Thorne. "Silver Hollow," the conductor barked, sliding the heavy door open. A gust of wind, biting and smelling of pine and horse manure, rushed into the car. "End of the line for you, miss." Clara stood, her legs trembling. She had exchanged 3 letters with Silas Thorne. He had written in a crisp, jagged hand. Unusual for a rancher. He claimed to own 3,000 acres bordering the darker edge of the mountain range. He promised security. He promised silence. That was all Clara needed. She stepped onto the wooden platform. The boards groaned under her boots. The town of Silver Hollow was barely a town at all. It was a scar on the hillside, a collection of leaning structures huddled together against the wind. A saloon, a general store, a livery, and the menacing shadow of a church steeple that looked more like a spear than a sanctuary. "Miss Vance?" The voice was low, rolling like thunder in a canyon. Clara turned. She had expected a rough man, the type with tobacco stains on his beard and dirt under his fingernails, the type she could manipulate or at least avoid. Silas Thorne was not that man. He stood near the edge of the platform, leaning against a wooden pillar with a casual, predatory grace. He was tall, wearing a black duster coat that fell to his spurs. His hat was pulled low, but beneath the brim, his eyes were visible. They were a piercing, unnatural blue, the color of glacial ice. He was clean-shaven, his jawline sharp enough to cut, and he held himself with the stillness of a man who never missed a shot. "Mr. Thorne?" Clara asked, her voice betraying a shiver that wasn't just from the cold. He didn't smile. He pushed off the pillar and walked toward her. The sound of his spurs chinking on the wood was rhythmic, deliberate. He stopped 2 feet from her, invading her space, forcing her to look up. "Clara," he said. He didn't ask it. He stated it. "I have my papers," she stammered, reaching into her coat. "The agency assured me that I don't need the papers." Silas interrupted. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The intimacy was shocking, immediate, and terrifying. "I know who you are." Clara froze. We've only exchanged letters, Mr. Thorne. You don't know me. Silas finally smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was a grim expression, filled with a secret joke she wasn't part of. I know you hate the smell of lavender because it reminds you of your mother's funeral. I know you read Jane Eyre once a year, every November, to remind yourself that plain women can survive fire. And I know you didn't leave Boston because of debt, Clara. You left because of what happened in the judge's chambers. Clara's blood turned to ice. The wind howled around them, but the silence between them was louder. She took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. How? She whispered. Who are you? I'm the man who paid for your ticket, Silas said, grabbing her valise with one hand and taking her elbow with the other. His grip was iron. And the storm is coming. We have a long ride to Obsidian Creek. He didn't wait for her consent. He steered her toward a waiting carriage, a black buggy drawn by two massive bays that looked as mean as their master. As Clara was hoisted up into the seat, she looked back at the train station, possessed by a sudden, violent urge to run. But the train was already venting steam, preparing to leave her behind. She was in the Wild West now, and she had just realized that the monster she fled in the East might have been safer than the stranger sitting beside her. The ride to the ranch took 3 hours. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. The landscape grew more hostile the further they traveled from town. The trees became twisted, skeletal shapes, and the rocks jutted out of the ground like broken teeth. Silas drove the horses with an effortless competence. He didn't look at her, yet Clara felt observed. Every time she shifted her weight, every time she took a breath, she felt his awareness of her. You're cold, Silas said suddenly. It wasn't a question. I'm fine, Clara lied. She was freezing. Her Boston wool coat was no match for a Wyoming winter. Without stopping the horses, Silas reached behind the seat and pulled out a heavy buffalo robe. He tossed it over her lap. As he tucked the edge in near her hip, his hand lingered for a second too long. Why did you say those things? Clara asked, gathering her courage. About Jane Eyre? About the judge? Silas stared at the road ahead, the reins loose in his hands. I make it my business to know the quality of my investments, Clara. I am not cattle, Mr. Thorne. No, he agreed softly. Cattle are easier to break. They turned a bend, and the ranch came into view. It was a fortress. Most homesteads out here were simple log cabins. Obsidian Creek was a sprawling 2-story structure made of dark timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that looked like a rib cage protecting the heart of the house. Smoke billowed from 3 different chimneys. It looked wealthy, imposing, and utterly lonely. A man was waiting by the stable doors, an older man with a limp and a face like a crumpled map. This was Jedediah, the ranch hand. He spat into the dirt as the carriage rolled to a stop. She make it, Jedediah grunted, eyeing Clara with suspicion. She made it, Silas said, jumping down. He didn't offer a hand to help Clara. He simply stood there and waited for her to descend, watching her struggle with the height of the carriage. It was a test. She gritted her teeth and jumped, landing ungracefully in the mud. Get her inside, Jed. Put her bags in the blue room, Silas ordered. I have to check the perimeter. The sheriff was sniffing around again, boss, Jedediah muttered low, but Clara heard it. Silas stiffened. His hand drifted almost imperceptibly toward the Colt revolver at his hip. What did you tell him? Told him you were fetching a bride. He laughed, said he didn't think you had a heart to give. He's right, Silas said, casting a glance at Clara. I don't. Inside, the house was shockingly warm, and it was here that the true horror began to settle in. Clara expected a bachelor squalor. Dust, antlers, maybe a few bearskins. Instead, the interior of Obsidian Creek was refined. There were Persian rugs on the floor. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls. A grand piano sat in the corner of the parlor, polished to a shine. Jedediah led her up the stairs. Boss wants you in the blue room. Says it's best for the light. He opened the door, and Clara gasped. It wasn't just a bedroom. It was a shrine. The walls were papered in a delicate floral pattern. Cornflowers and lilies. A pattern Clara had once admired in a shop window in Boston 3 years ago, but never bought because it was too expensive. On the vanity table sat a silver hairbrush set, the exact make and model she had sold to a pawnbroker to pay for her train ticket. But the most disturbing detail was the dress laid out on the bed. It was a deep emerald velvet gown. It was cut in the latest 1887 fashion, with a bustle and high neck. Dinner is at 7, Jedediah said, lingering in the doorway. Boss likes punctuality, and he likes that color. How? Clara picked up the dress, her hands shaking. How did he know my size? How did he know I like this color? Jedediah shrugged, his eyes dark. Silas Thorne don't guess, miss. He prepares. He's been working on this room for 6 months. 6 months? Clara whispered. I only answered his ad 4 weeks ago. Jedediah didn't answer. He just closed the door. The click of the latch sounded like a prison cell locking. Clara stood in the center of the room, the silence of the house pressing in on her. She walked to the window. Down below, in the yard, she saw Silas. He wasn't checking the perimeter. He was standing in the snow, looking up at her window. He wasn't moving. He was just watching, his breath clouding in the air. He raised a hand and touched the brim of his hat. Clara backed away from the window, her heart racing. She went to the vanity to splash water on her face, trying to wake herself up from this nightmare. She looked at the silver hairbrush. She turned it over. Engraved on the handle, in worn, familiar script, were the initials CV. Clara dropped the brush. It clattered loudly against the wood. It wasn't a replica. It was her brush. The one she had sold in a dingy pawn shop on the other side of the country, 2,000 miles away, less than a month ago. Silas Thorne hadn't just been waiting for a bride. He had been tracking her every move. He had followed her fall from grace, step by step, collecting pieces of her life like trophies. And now, he had the ultimate prize. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, the sound echoing through the house like a judge's gavel. Clara stood before the mirror in the blue room. The emerald dress fit her with terrifying precision. It cinched at her waist and flared at her hips, the velvet heavy and luxurious, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn logs of the cabin walls. She looked like a woman from a painting, framed in a rustic nightmare. She descended the stairs, her hand gripping the banister until her knuckles turned white. The smell of roasted venison and rosemary wafted up from the dining room, a domestic scent that felt wrong in this house of secrets. Silas was waiting at the head of the long mahogany table. He had changed. The duster and spurs were gone, replaced by a crisp white shirt, a black vest, and a dark cravat. He looked less like a cowboy and more like a lord of the manor, but the gun belt was still draped over the back of his chair. He stood as she entered. His blue eyes raked over her, taking in the dress. For a moment, his mask slipped. A look of raw, agonizing pain crossed his face, so intense that Clara almost took a step back. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by that cold, predatory amusement. "Perfect," he murmured. "Please, sit." Clara sat. The table was set for two, but it was long enough for 12. A candelabra burned between them, casting flickering shadows against the walls. "Where is Jedediah?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "Jed eats in the bunkhouse. He prefers his own company, and I prefer yours." Silas poured red wine into her crystal glass. "It's a vintage from Napa Valley, 1878, a good year. That was the year your father was appointed to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, wasn't it?" Clara's hand froze halfway to the glass. "You know a great deal about my father." "I know a great deal about powerful men, Clara. I know how they build their empires, and I know what they bury in the foundations to keep them standing." He cut into his venison with surgical precision. "Tell me, did the judge approve of your little rebellion? Running away to the savage West?" "He's dead," Clara said sharply. "You know that." "Yes. Heart attack. Convenient." Silas took a sip of wine, his eyes never leaving hers. "Right before the indictment came down. Right before the corruption scandal broke. He died a hero, and you were left to clean up the mess. The debts. The angry investors. The men in shadows who wanted their money back." Clara slammed her fork down. "I am not hungry." "Eat," Silas commanded softly. "You're too thin. Guilt burns a lot of calories." "Why am I here, Silas?" Clara demanded, her fear giving way to anger. "You have my hairbrush. You have my dress. You know my family's history. Are you one of them? Did the syndicate send you to collect the money my father stole?" Silas laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "The syndicate. Those soft-handed bankers in Boston. They couldn't survive a night in these mountains. No, Clara, I don't work for them. I don't work for anyone." He leaned forward, the candlelight dancing in his eyes. "I brought you here because you are the key." "The key to what?" "To the one thing your father loved more than money. The one thing he protected, even when he was burning the rest of the world down." "I don't understand." "You will." Silas stood up abruptly. "I have work to do in the barn. Do not leave the house. The wolves are hungry tonight, and they don't care about your pretty dress." He grabbed his gun belt, buckled it on, and walked out into the howling wind. As soon as the heavy front door slammed shut, Clara moved. She didn't go to her room. She went to the one door she hadn't tried yet. The double doors at the end of the hall. The handle turned. It was unlocked. She slipped inside. It was a study, dominated by a massive desk and walls lined with maps. But these weren't maps of Wyoming cattle trails. They were maps of cities. New York, Chicago, Boston. Clara hurried to the desk. It was covered in ledgers. She opened the top one. It was a log of cattle sales. Mundane. Boring. She opened the second one. Expenses for feed and grain. She pulled open the center drawer. It was locked. Clara looked around frantically. She grabbed a letter opener from the desk. A sharp, silver blade shaped like a dagger. She jammed it into the lock and twisted. The mechanism was old. It clicked open with a snap. Inside, there was no money. There was a single thick leather-bound book. She pulled it out. The leather was cracked and worn. Embossed on the cover were the initials ST. She opened it. It wasn't a diary. It was a dossier. The first page was a tintype photograph of a young man, barely 18, standing next to a young woman with laughing eyes. The boy was clearly Silas. though his face was softer, full of hope. The woman, Clara gasped. The woman looked exactly like her. Not similar, identical. The same curve of the jaw, same wide eyes. She turned the page. Entry, June 4th, 1877. Eleanor accepted my proposal. We will marry in the spring, before the herd moves north. She turned another page. Entry, August 12th, 1877. The land dispute is getting worse. A lawyer from the east, a man named Vance, has arrived. He claims the deed to the valley is invalid. He represents the railroad. Clara's heart stopped. Vance. Her father. She flipped forward, her hands trembling so hard she nearly tore the pages. Entry, October 30, 1877. They came in the night. Pinkerton agents. They said they were evicting us. A warning shot fired. Then chaos. The fire started in the barn. Eleanor was inside. The handwriting became jagged, erratic, as if written by a madman. Entry, November 1st, 1877. She is gone, burned. Vance signed the eviction order. He stood on the hill and watched it burn. He called it progress. I call it murder. Clara stared at the words. Her father, the Honorable Judge Vance, the man who had raised her on Sunday sermons and piano lessons. He had been a land shark for the railroads in his youth. He had burned a woman alive to clear a valley for a train track. And that woman was Silas Thorne's fiancée. Clara looked back at the photo. The woman, Eleanor, looked like Clara because she was your mother's sister, a voice said from the doorway. Clara spun around. Silas was standing there. He was dripping wet from the snow. He wasn't angry. He looked tired, infinitely tired. My aunt? Clara whispered. Your mother never told you, did she? Silas walked into the room, closing the door behind him. She never told you that she had a twin sister who ran away to the west to marry a cowboy. She never told you that your father fell in love with your mother because she was the ghost of the woman he killed. Clara backed up against the desk, clutching the journal to her chest. You brought me here for revenge, because I look like her, because I am his daughter. I brought you here, Silas said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, because you are the only evidence left. Evidence? Your father didn't just steal land, Clara. He stole gold. Confederate gold that was supposed to be lost. He buried it somewhere, and he wrote the location in a code only two people knew. Him and Eleanor. Silas took a step closer. Eleanor is dead, but you have her eyes. You have her blood. And before your father died, he sent you a letter, didn't he? A letter you never opened. A letter you hid in the lining of your valise. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. The letter. The thick envelope her father had pressed into her hand on his deathbed. He had whispered, "For when the wolves come." She had never opened it, too afraid of his final words. I don't want the gold, Clara, Silas said, his eyes burning with a cold blue fire. I want the confession. I want to prove to the world that Judge Vance was a murderer, and you are going to help me do it. And if I refuse, Clara challenged, though her voice shook. Silas stopped inches from her. The smell of snow and gun oil overwhelmed her senses. You won't refuse, he said, because the men who killed your father, they know about the letter too, and they are coming. As if on cue, a gunshot cracked through the night air outside, shattering the window in the hallway. Glass rained down. Silas blew out the candle instantly, plunging the room into darkness. He tackled Clara, driving her to the floor behind the heavy oak desk, just as a second bullet tore through the wood where she had been standing. Stay down, Silas hissed, drawing his Colt. The wolves are here. The silence following the gunshots was heavier than the storm. Clara lay pressed against the rough floorboards, the smell of dust and old paper filling her nose. Silas's weight was heavy on top of her, shielding her body with his own. She could feel his heart beating against her back, slow, steady, rhythmic. It was the heartbeat of a man who had lived in war for a decade. "Who is it?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hired guns," Silas murmured, his lips close to her ear. "They track fast. Faster than I thought." He rolled off her, moving in a crouch toward the window. He peered through the crack in the curtains. Outside, the blizzard had momentarily cleared, leaving a bright, moonlit landscape of blue snow and black shadows. "3 riders," Silas announced. 2 near the tree line, 1 circling the barn. "Are they the syndicate?" "Worse. They're the law." Clara's blood ran cold. "The sheriff." "Sheriff Miller isn't a sheriff, Clara. He's a cleaner. He cleans up messes for the railroad tycoons. And right now, you're the mess." Silas turned back to her. In the moonlight, his face was hard angles and determination. "Listen to me. I'm going to go out the back. I'll draw their fire toward the ridge. You stay here. Do not move until I come back." "No!" Clara grabbed his arm. The velvet of her sleeve brushed against his rough shirt. "You can't go out there alone. It's suicide." Silas looked at her hand on his arm, then up to her eyes. For a second, the ghost of the boy in the photograph flickered in his expression. "I've been dead for 10 years, Clara. You can't kill a ghost." He pulled away, checked the cylinder of his revolver, and slipped out of the room like a shadow. Clara waited. Minutes stretched into hours. She heard shouting, then the deafening boom of a shotgun, Silas's heavy gauge, then the rapid pop, pop, pop of return fire. Silence. Then the sound of boots on the porch. Heavy boots. Slow. Deliberate. "Mrs. Thorne?" a voice called out. It was cheerful, folksy. "Mrs. Thorne, are you in there?" It wasn't Silas. Clara scrambled backward, crawling under the knee-hole of the desk. She clutched the letter opener. The front door creaked open. "Silas is a dangerous man, Miss Vance," the voice continued, moving into the hallway. "He's got a lot of delusions. Thinks the whole world is out to get him. We just want to help you. We want to take you back to Boston, back to civilization." Clara held her breath. Through the gap under the desk, she saw a pair of boots enter the study. They were polished, too clean for Wyoming. "Come on out, Clara," the man said. "I know you have the letter. Your father told us before he passed. He was delirious, of course, but he mentioned it. Just give it to me, and you can go home." Clara saw the man's hand drop into view. He was holding a lantern in one hand and a glistening Bowie knife in the other. He wasn't here to take her home. "I know you're in here," the man sighed. He kicked the chair aside. He bent down, peering under the desk. It was Sheriff Miller. His face was round and smiling, but his eyes were dead. "Gotcha." He reached for her. Clara screamed and drove the letter opener downward with all her strength. The blade sank into the sheriff's hand. He howled, dropping the lantern. The glass shattered, and oil spilled across the rug, igniting instantly. Fire whooshed up, creating a wall of heat between them. The sheriff stumbled back, cursing, pulling the blade from his hand. "You little witch!" He lunged through the flames, ignoring the fire. Clara scrambled back, trapped against the bookshelves. She had nowhere to go. The sheriff raised the knife, the flames reflecting in the steel. Bang! The front of the sheriff's head exploded in a mist of red. He stood there for a second, looking confused, before toppling forward into the burning rug. Behind him, standing in the doorway, framed by the smoke and the night, was Silas. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, and his left arm hung uselessly at his side, soaked in blood. But in his right hand, the Colt was smoking. He didn't look at the body. He looked at Clara. "Get up!" he roared, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "The house is gone. We have to move." Clara scrambled to her feet, coughing in the thick smoke. The fire was spreading fast, eating the dry paper of the maps and books. The history of Silas's obsession was burning. Silas grabbed her with his good arm, hauling her out of the study, down the hall, and out into the freezing night. They collapsed into the snow in the yard. The cold air seared Clara's lungs. She looked back. Obsidian Creek, the fortress, was engulfed. Flames licked the roof. The sanctuary was destroyed. "Jed!" Silas yelled. "I'm here, boss." Jedediah appeared from the darkness, leading 2 horses. He looked grim. "I got the pack mule, got the ammo." "The sheriff?" Jed asked, looking at the burning house. "Dead," Silas spat. "But the other 2 got away. They'll be riding to the telegraph station in Silver Hollow. We have maybe 6 hours before a posse of 20 men comes down on us." Silas turned to Clara. He was pale, losing blood. He reached into his coat and pulled out a scarf, wrapping it tightly around his wounded arm. "Can you ride?" he asked. Clara looked at the burning house, then at the dead body of the man who had tried to kill her, and finally at the cowboy who had saved her. The debutante from Boston was dead. She had died the moment she stabbed the sheriff. "Yes," Clara said, her voice hard. "I can ride." "Good," Silas said, mounting his horse with a groan of pain. "Because we aren't running away anymore." "Where are we going?" Clara asked, struggling onto the second horse. Silas turned his horse toward the dark, jagged peaks of the mountains, the forbidden territory where no lawman dared to go. "We're going to the ghost mines," Silas said. "We're going to find your father's gold, and we're going to use it to buy a war." The blizzard did not care about their desperation. It was a living, breathing beast that chewed on the mountainside, spitting ice and wind into the faces of the 3 riders. They had been riding for 6 hours, climbing higher into the jagged teeth of the Sawtooth Range. The air was thin here, sharp as broken glass in the lungs. The horses were struggling, post-holing through chest-deep snowdrifts, their breath pluming in thick, exhausted clouds. Silas was dying. Clara could see it in the way he slumped in the saddle. The makeshift bandage on his arm had soaked through hours ago, the dark stain spreading across his duster like spilled ink. He hadn't spoken in miles. His chin was buried in his chest, his body swaying dangerously with every step of the bay horse. "We have to stop," Clara screamed over the wind. She pulled her scarf down, her lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. Jedediah, riding ahead on the mule, turned back. His old face was a mask of ice crystals. "Can't stop here, miss. Exposure will kill us in an hour. There's a trapper's cave up past the ridge. 2 miles. "He won't make 2 miles, Clara shouted, pointing at Silas. As if hearing his name, Silas lifted his head. His face was a ghastly shade of gray, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He looked at Clara, but he didn't see her. "Eleanor," he rasped, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "Don't go in the barn." Then his eyes rolled back, and he slid sideways off the horse. "Silas!" Clara threw herself from her saddle, landing in the snow and scrambling toward him. He was heavy, dead weight in the drift. She grabbed his shoulders, turning him over, The snow beneath him was stained pink. Jedediah was there a moment later, his movements surprisingly fast for a crippled man. He knelt beside them, checking Silas's pulse. "He's burning up," Jed growled. "Bullet must have nicked the bone. Infection travels fast in the blood." "We can't leave him," Clara said, her voice fierce. "Didn't say we would," Jed grunted. He looked up at the ridge. "But we can't carry him on the horse neither. He'll fall again. We have to drag him." They fashioned a travois out of pine branches and the buffalo robe. It took precious minutes where the cold seeped into Clara's bones, threatening to shut her body down. They strapped Silas onto the sled, and Jedediah tied it to the mule. The trek to the cave was a blur of agony. Clara walked beside the sled, holding Silas's hand, rubbing it to keep the circulation moving. He muttered constantly now, trapped in a fever dream of 10 years ago. He spoke of fire. He spoke of a baby that never cried. He spoke of a love that felt like a knife. When they finally reached the cave, a shallow recess behind a screen of frozen jagged rocks, it felt like a palace. Jedediah got a fire going with dry wood stored in the back, while Clara stripped the frozen layers of clothes off Silas. The wound was ugly. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of the upper arm, but the exit wound was jagged and inflamed. "I need whiskey," Clara commanded. She didn't recognize her own voice. It was steady, authoritative. Jedediah handed her a flask and a hunting knife. "You gonna do this, miss?" "He saved my life," Clara said, uncorking the flask. "I'm saving his." She poured the alcohol over the wound. Silas arched his back, a guttural scream tearing from his throat, echoing off the cave walls. He thrashed, his eyes flying open, wild and terrified. "Hold him down," Clara yelled. Jedediah pinned Silas's shoulders to the ground. Clara took the knife. She didn't hesitate. She had seen her father's doctors treat hunting accidents. She knew what dead tissue looked like. She cut away the ragged edges of the skin, cleaning the wound as Silas sobbed in pain, his strength fading. She tore strips from her petticoat, the expensive silk from Boston, and bound the arm tight. "It's done," she whispered, collapsing back against the cold stone wall. Her hands were covered in his blood. Silas fell into a fitful sleep. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like demons. Jedediah sat by the entrance, his rifle across his lap, watching the storm outside. "He loved her, Jedediah said softly, not looking at Clara. Clara looked at Silas's sleeping face. In the firelight, the harsh lines of his face were softened. He looked young again. "My aunt," Clara said. "Eleanor," Jed corrected. "She was the only thing that made him human. Silas, he grew up hard, orphaned at 10, raised by wolves practically." Eleanor was soft. She taught him to read, taught him poetry. Jed spit into the fire. "When your father's men burned that barn, Silas was in town buying a ring. He came back to Ash. He found her body, or what was left of it." Clara felt a tear slide down her cheek. "He said there was a baby." Jed nodded slowly. "She was with child. 3 months. Silas lost his wife and his son in one night. That kind of hate. It don't fade, Miss Vance. It petrifies, turns a man to stone." Clara looked down at her valise, which she had dragged into the cave. "He said my father stole gold, that he hid it." "The judge was a greedy man," Jed agreed. "But Silas doesn't care about the gold. He wants the ledger. He thinks the judge kept a diary of his crimes. Proof that the government sanctioned the burning of this valley to make way for the railroad. Silas wants to burn their world down, just like they burned his." Clara reached into the lining of her valise. Her fingers brushed the thick envelope. For when the wolves come. She pulled it out. The seal was unbroken. The wax was stamped with her father's ring. She broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of parchment and a heavy iron key. The parchment didn't contain a confession. It contained a map, a hand-drawn sketch of the mountain range they were currently in, and at the bottom, a riddle written in her father's elegant, deceitful hand. Where the sinner kneels to pray, but the God has looked away. Below the pulpit of stone, the dead sleep not alone. I know where this is, Clara whispered. Jedediah looked over. You do? The pulpit of stone, Clara said, tracing the map. It's not a church. It's a rock formation. My father. He used to take me hiking in the Adirondacks. He named rocks. He called huge overhanging cliffs pulpits. She pointed to a drawing of a distinctive anvil-shaped peak on the map. This is it. It looks like a preacher leaning over a congregation. Jedediah squinted at the map. That's Dead Man's Drop, about 4 miles north of here. But there ain't nothing there but an old mine shaft, collapsed years ago. The dead sleep not alone, Clara recited. It's in the mine. Suddenly Silas stirred. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. The fever had broken, leaving him soaked in sweat and pale as the snow, but his eyes were clear. The ice was back in them. Water, he croaked. Clara hurried to him, lifting his head to help him drink from the canteen. He drank greedily, then looked at her. Really looked at her. You stayed, he said. It was a statement of disbelief. You needed me, Clara said simply. Silas looked at the bandage on his arm, then at the map in her hand. He saw the iron key. You opened it. I did. And we're going to find it, Silas, Clara said, her voice hardening with a resolve she didn't know she possessed. Not for the gold, and not for your revenge, but because my father destroyed your life, and he destroyed mine too. He made me a pawn. I want to see what he was protecting that was worth more than his own daughter. Silas reached out with his good hand. He didn't grab her. He just laid his hand over hers, covering the blood stains on her fingers with his own calloused palm. We ride at dawn, he said, before the posse cuts the trail. The storm broke in the morning, leaving the world blindingly white and silent. The journey to Dead Man's Drop was slow. Silas rode tied to his saddle, his strength returning in flashes, but his body still battered. Clara rode beside him, her rifle, Jedediah's spare Winchester, resting across her lap. She wasn't holding it like a lady anymore. She was holding it like a soldier. Dead Man's Drop was a terrifying sheer cliff face that plummeted 1,000 feet into a gorge. Halfway down the cliff, accessible only by a narrow, treacherous goat path, was the black maw of a mine entrance. The Black Ridge Mine, Jedediah explained as they dismounted, hiding the horses in a cluster of pines. Silver mine, went bust in 75, bad air, men died. Perfect place for a tomb, Silas muttered. He checked his Colt. He had reloaded it, cleaning the mechanism with a rag. He looked at Clara. You stay here with the horses? No, Clara said. She held up the iron key. You need this, and you need me to read the map. The tunnels will be a maze. Silas stared at her for a long moment. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't flinch. Fine, he said. Stay behind me. If I shoot, you drop. They descended the path single file. The drop to the right was dizzying. One slip, and they would be nothing but stains on the rocks below. The entrance to the mine was boarded up with rotting timber. Silas kicked the wood. It crumbled like wet cake. They stepped inside. The darkness was absolute. Jedediah lit a kerosene lantern. The light pushed back the shadows, revealing rough-hewn walls dripping with moisture. The air smelled of sulfur and stagnant water. "Follow the draft," Silas whispered. "Bad air settles low. If the flame turns blue, we run." They walked for what felt like an hour. The mine was a labyrinth of intersecting tunnels. Clara kept checking the map, counting the turns. Left at the split beam, right at the water pump. "Here," Clara said, stopping in front of a collapsed section of the tunnel. "The map says below the pulpit. This tunnel goes directly under the peak of the mountain." "It's blocked," Jedediah said, shining the light on the pile of rubble. "No," Silas said. He moved closer, running his hand along the rock wall. "Look at the debris. It's too neat. This wasn't a collapse. It was a wall." He grabbed a pickaxe that had been left rusting against the wall. Gritting his teeth against the pain in his arm, he swung. Clang. The rock fell away, revealing wood underneath. A false wall. With Jedediah's help, they tore down the barrier. Behind it was a steel door, set directly into the rock. It looked like a bank vault, absurdly out of place in the damp darkness. "The key," Silas said. Clara stepped forward. Her hand trembled as she inserted the iron key into the lock. It was stiff, rusted. She used both hands and turned. Click. The heavy tumblers groaned. Silas pushed the door open. They raised the lantern. The room beyond was small, carved out of the solid granite. It wasn't filled with gold bars stacked to the ceiling. It was filled with crates, government crates, stamped U.S. Treasury, 1865. "Confederate gold?" Jedediah whispered. "The lost shipment?" Silas pried the lid off the nearest crate. Gold coins spilled out, glittering in the lantern light. Thousands of them. Millions of dollars. Enough to buy a state. Enough to buy an army. But Silas didn't touch the gold. He pushed the crate aside, looking for something else. "Where is it?" he hissed. "Where is the ledger?" Clara saw a small metal lockbox sitting on a shelf in the back, separate from the gold. "There." She grabbed it. It wasn't locked. She opened it. Inside was a thick, leather-bound book, identical to the one Silas had kept. Silas took it. He flipped through the pages. His eyes widened. "My God," he whispered. "What is it?" Clara asked. "It's not just your father," Silas said, his voice shaking with rage. "It's the governor, the senators, the railroad tycoons. They stole this gold during the war to fund their own expansion. They used it to hire mercenaries to clear the land, to kill the natives, to burn the farmers." He stopped at a page. He looked at Clara, his face pale. "And here," he pointed, "the order to burn my ranch. It wasn't your father who signed it, Clara." Clara looked at the signature. It wasn't Vance. It was Thorne. "What?" Clara gasped. "William Thorne," Silas read. "My brother. My own brother sold me out to the railroad for a cut of this gold." The revelation sucked the air out of the room. Silas slumped against the wall, the book hanging from his hand. His entire crusade, his 10 years of hatred, had been directed at the wrong man. The judge had been the instrument, but his own blood had been the architect. "He's the governor now," Jedediah said quietly. "William Thorne is the governor of Wyoming." Silas began to laugh, a low, broken sound. "I've been hunting ghosts while my brother sits in the governor's mansion, spending the blood money." "Silas," Clara said, reaching for him. "Don't touch me," he snapped, pulling away. He looked broken. It was all a lie. Eleanor died for nothing. She died because my brother wanted to be rich. Boom! A massive explosion rocked the mine. Dust showered down from the ceiling. What was that? Clara screamed. Jedediah ran to the doorway, looking back down the tunnel. Dynamite! They're blowing the entrance. The posse? Clara asked. No, Silas said, his eyes suddenly sharp again. He realized the trap. The sheriff wasn't the only cleaner. If they knew we were coming here, they didn't send a posse to arrest us. They sent a demolition crew, Jedediah yelled, racking his rifle. They're sealing us in. They want the evidence buried forever. Another explosion, closer this time. The ground heaved. Run! Silas roared. He grabbed the ledger and the lockbox. Leave the gold. We have to get out before the ceiling comes down. They scrambled back into the tunnel. The air was thick with dust now, choking them. The lantern light swung wildly as they ran. The main entrance will be blocked, Jedediah shouted. Is there another way? The air shaft, Silas yelled. Map says there's a ventilation shaft on the east drift. They turned right, sprinting through the dark. The mine groaned around them, the timbers cracking under the pressure of the shifting mountain. They reached the end of the drift. A vertical shaft shot upwards. A narrow wooden ladder bolted to the rock, disappearing into the dark above. Up! Silas ordered Clara. She grabbed the rungs. They were slick with slime. She climbed, her breath coming in sobbing gasps. Silas pushed Jedediah toward the ladder. Go, old man. I'm too slow, boss, Jedediah said. He turned back toward the tunnel. He was holding a bundle of dynamite sticks he had pulled from his saddlebag. Jed, what are you doing? Silas stopped. They're coming down the main tunnel, Jedediah said calmly. I can hear 'em. If they reach the shaft, they'll shoot you off the ladder like birds. No, Silas grabbed him. We leave together. Someone's got to collapse the tunnel behind you, Jedediah said. He looked at Silas with a sad smile. You got a war to fight, Silas. Go get your brother. Jedediah shoved Silas toward the ladder and lit the fuse on his dynamite. Go. Silas looked at the old man, his only friend for 10 years. He made a sound of pure anguish, then turned and scrambled up the ladder. He was 10 feet up when the tunnel below exploded. The shock wave nearly knocked Clara off the ladder. Heat surged up the shaft. Don't look down, Silas screamed from below her. Climb, Clara. Climb for your life. They climbed toward the tiny circle of daylight above, while the mountain collapsed beneath them, burying the gold, the history, and the loyal old man who had given everything for a cowboy's revenge. They burst out of the ground into the blinding snow, gasping, coughing, alive. But they weren't alone. Surrounding the air shaft, guns drawn, were 20 men on horseback, and in the center, wearing a fine wool coat and a governor's sash, sat a man who looked exactly like Silas, but without the scars. William Thorne smiled. Hello, brother, he said. I see you found my retirement fund. William Thorne sat atop his white stallion, looking down at them like a king. He was Silas's mirror image, polished, wealthy, and cruel. I heard you were living like an animal, brother, William sneered, his 20 mercenaries training their rifles on Silas. I didn't realize you'd become one. Silas swayed, clutching his bleeding arm. You signed the order, he rasped. You burned Eleanor. You killed your own nephew for a railroad spur. I did it for the governorship, William roared. Progress requires sacrifice. Now give me the ledger, and I'll let the girl go. You stay here and rot with your ghosts. Clara stepped forward, clutching the leather book to her chest. She could feel the ground trembling beneath them. The mine below was unstable from the earlier blasts. "I have the book," Clara announced, walking toward the governor. She pulled Silas's silver lighter from her pocket and flicked it open, holding the flame dangerously close to the dry pages. "But I'd rather burn it than give it to a murderer." "No!" William screamed, spurring his horse forward. "Don't be a fool!" The mercenaries hesitated, watching the book, their payday threatened by fire. It was the distraction Silas needed. Broken and bleeding, Silas didn't reach for his gun. He grabbed the last bundle of dynamite Jedediah had secretly slipped into his pocket and hurled it, not at the men, but into the open ventilation shaft behind them. The explosion wasn't a bang. It was a sickening crunch. The blast destroyed the final support pillars. The mountain groaned, and the rock ledge beneath the mercenaries sheared off. In seconds, the earth swallowed the 20 men, sliding them into the abyss of the collapsing mine. William was thrown from his panicked horse. He scrambled up from the snow, mud staining his fine coat, and leveled a gold-plated revolver at his brother. "Die!" William shrieked. Crack! The bullet struck Silas in the chest. He fell back, gasping. William grinned, cocking the hammer for a second shot, but he never pulled the trigger. Clara stood 10 feet away, the Winchester rifle raised. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were dead. "That," she said, her voice cutting through the wind, "was for the girl in the barn." She fired. William Thorne fell backward, a crimson stain blooming on his white shirt, dead before he hit the ground. Clara dropped the rifle and ran to Silas, collapsing in the snow beside him. She pressed her hands against his chest, trying to staunch the flow of blood, but it was too fast. "We won," she sobbed, holding up the unburned ledger. "Silas, stay with me. We have the proof." Silas smiled weakly, his hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I never wanted the gold, Clara," he whispered, his voice fading with the wind. "I just wanted silence." His hand slipped from her cheek. His eyes closed. And on the frozen peak of the Rockies, Clara Vance was left alone with the silence he had finally found. They say Silas Thorne died on that mountain. The official report from the territory of Wyoming stated that Governor William Thorne and his brother perished in a tragic mining accident caused by unstable geography. The posse was listed as missing, but history is written by the survivors. And the ledger of Judge Vance and Governor Thorne never made it to the newspapers. It made it to the desk of the President of the United States. 3 months later, a federal investigation dismantled the corrupt land syndicate in the West. It was an anonymous tip, delivered with a package containing undeniable proof of murder, theft, and treason. As for Clara Vance, she never returned to Boston. Her family declared her dead, a victim of the savage West. But if you go to the town of Silver Hollow today, the old-timers will tell you a different story. They'll tell you about a woman who bought the land where Obsidian Creek once stood. She didn't rebuild the fortress. She built a simple ranch, a sanctuary for horses. She never married. She lived alone, they say. But sometimes, during the worst blizzards of the year, when the wind howls like a mourning woman, travelers would claim to see a rider on the ridge, a tall man in a black duster watching over the ranch. And they say that every evening, the woman would sit on her porch with 2 glasses of Napa Valley wine, one for her and one for the empty chair beside her. Clara Vance didn't just survive the West. She tamed it. She kept the gold, not in a bank, but in the silence she bought with it. She lived the rest of her days on the land that love had died for, guarding the memory of the cowboy who had loved her and hunted her before she ever arrived. And that is the tragic, twisted, and true legend of Silas Thorne and Clara Vance. A story of revenge that turned into redemption, and a mail-order marriage that brought down a government. It makes you wonder, how many other secrets are buried beneath the mountains of the American West? And if you were Clara, would you have burned the ledger or used it to become the most powerful woman in the territory? Let me know what you would have done in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark history of the Wild West, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story from the frontier. Until next time, keep your powder dry.